You're listening to This Land, a podcast about broken promises, tribal land, and murder. This year, the Supreme Court was supposed to decide whether half the land in Oklahoma is Indian country. But in a shocking twist, they postponed their decision until next year. The fate of this land still hangs in the balance. From Crooked Media, I'm your host, Rebecca Nagel, citizen of Cherokee Nation. In this episode, we're not going to focus on Carpenter versus Murphy. Instead, we're taking you to the next battleground for Native American rights. Like the Murphy case, it starts in one place and ends up somewhere completely different. You'll see similar tactics from the opposition and hear some familiar voices, like Lisa Blatt.
You are rendering these women second-class citizens with inferior rights to direct their reproductive rights and who raises their child.
But the story I'm going to tell you in this episode has even bigger stakes. There's a small group of people working to take down the legal structure upholding Native rights in this country, and they found a sneaky way to do it. It all centers around one law, the Indian Child Welfare Act. But to fully grasp the gravity of this threat, we have to start with ICWA and why it was created in the first place. ICWA was passed in response to a crisis. Native kids were being adopted out of their families and tribes at alarming rates. Here's Chrissy Nemo, citizen of Cherokee Nation and the Deputy Attorney General of our tribe.
ICWA was passed in 1978 by the United States Congress, and research leading up to the Indian Child Welfare Act and the congressional hearings found that 1/3 of all Indian children in the United States were in out-of-home placements, and between 85 and 95% of those children were in non-Indian or non-relative placements.
This wasn't a coincidence. It was the result of federal policy, the Indian Adoption Project. Kids were taken from their homes just because their parents were Indian. The policy met the very definition of institutionalized racism.
We know from testimony during the passage of ICWA that many of those practices were very coercive. For example, a mother would have 2 other children already in her home and be told if she didn't place this baby for adoption that all of her children would be taken by social services. Both federal and state governments believed that the best thing for these children were to get them away from their families and away from the reservation and integrate them into kind of mainstream white American society.
In other words, this was another U.S. policy aimed at assimilating Native Americans and slowly chipping away at tribes. And that's why ICWA was created. The law works in 3 ways to keep Native kids with Native families. First, to take away the rights of an Indian parent, there has to be proof that they pose a threat to their child. Second, ICWA gives priority for placement to family members, other tribal members, and other Native homes. And last, the law gives tribes jurisdiction over their citizens who end up in the child welfare system. While the law sounds like a straightforward way to protect Native kids, it's become controversial in recent years. And that controversy started with a case you may have heard of, especially if you were a fan of Dr. Phil in 2013.
They adopted a Native American baby until the tribe stepped in.
They had to turn her over.
How do you explain to a 2-year-old that you might not ever see them again?
You want to commit cultural genocide, steal a people's children.
We were told we couldn't adopt them because we are white and they are Indian.
No, that's not white.
What I hear you saying is what's best for the tribe and not what's best for the child.
Next, Dr. Phil.
They're talking about the Supreme Court case, Adoptive Couple versus Baby Girl. It was a custody battle over a child named Veronica. She never asked to be the center of a national media storm or a Supreme Court battle. Before she was born, her mother put her up for adoption. But her father, Dustin Brown, didn't know about it. And that was a problem, because before an adoption can go forward, ICWA requires that notifications are sent to the father and the tribe. The adoption agency did send Cherokee Nation a notice, but it was missing some crucial information.
The notice we received, though, his first name was spelled wrong and his date of birth was wrong. I think if either of those would have been correct, we would have affirmed that he was a Cherokee member.
But without the correct information, Cherokee Nation didn't realize Veronica was one of their own.
Interestingly, in trial, the mother stated that when she heard that information, she knew it was wrong, told the adoption agencies and the attorneys involved that it was wrong.
But the adoption agency never corrected the information. If it had, Veronica would have never left Oklahoma.
They simply proceeded as if Veronica were not an Indian child.
She was adopted by a white couple in South Carolina. Dustin was notified of the adoption just days before being deployed to Iraq. He signed the form because he thought he was giving custody to his ex-fiancée, Veronica's birth mother, not to a white couple in South Carolina. But once he realized Veronica was actually going to live with strangers, he panicked. He was able to pause the adoption thanks to a relief act for service members. Just a week later, he left for Iraq.
The media couched it as this wonderful, caring, upper middle class adoptive family who took in this child, the only home that she had ever known. And here comes, deadbeat Indian dad trying to use this special law to give him special protections.
The media made it seem like Matthew and Melanie Capobianco, the adoptive couple, were the real victims.
When we walked out of the door, she cried after us and held her arms out after us.
Do you think this change was in the best interest of this child?
Absolutely not.
But a family court in South Carolina said Dustin Brown's parental rights couldn't be terminated under ICWA unless there was evidence he threatened the well-being of his child. And there was none.
So the court ordered that ICWA applied, his parental rights could not be terminated, that he was a fit parent, and that it was in the child's best interest to be returned to her biological father.
Veronica was 2 when she met her dad for the first time. Chrissy was there.
And I think even at that young of an age, like seeing someone who reflects what you look like, and then whatever just kind of innate sense that you have of, this is my family. And she thrived in that home. I saw her often during the time that she was here.
For the next 2 years, Veronica lived with her dad in Oklahoma while the court battle continued. And that's where they thought she would stay until the case went to the Supreme Court.
If you affirm below, you're basically banning the interracial adoption of abandoned Indian children.
This is Lisa Blatt. She represented Oklahoma in the Murphy case. Remember when I told you that she's a go-to lawyer for anti-tribal interests in the Supreme Court? The baby Veronica case is one of the reasons why. She represented the adoptive couple for free. And back then, she used scare tactics too.
You are relegating adoptive parents to go to the back of the bus and wait in line if they can adopt. And you're basically relegating the child to a piece of property with a sign that says, Indian, keep off, do not disturb.
And it worked. Cherokee Nation and Dustin Brown lost.
The court found that because Dustin never had legal or physical custody of Veronica, that the ICWA provisions that prevented the termination of his parental rights didn't apply to him.
More legal procedures followed in state courts, but after her family had done everything they could to keep her, the day came when they had to say goodbye. After living with her dad and grandparents for half her life, Veronica returned to the Capobiancos in South Carolina. Chrissy was there that day.
And the decision was made to do the physical transfer that afternoon. We asked that he be allowed to have 2 hours with her, and they told us we had an hour. While we were getting ready to walk out the door, Dustin's dad, Tommy, collapsed. He had what we thought at the time may have been a heart attack. We later learned that it was, panic attack. I think it was a broken heart. But, we talked about who was going to do this.
Veronica's family felt like they couldn't hand their child over.
I was one of the few people in the room outside of Veronica's family who she knew and knew by name. And so I told them that I would. And so I carried her outside to an SUV, and they had a car seat in the back seat. And I put her in there and helped him strap her in her car seat. And told her that her dad loved her. And I remember, especially now that I'm a mom, I always tell people when I talk about this story that had I been a parent at the time, I don't know that I could have done that. But I think about how my child would act if they knew that they were leaving. And you would expect them, I think, to be loud and maybe irrational and crying. And that wasn't the reaction that she had. She simply sat with her head down, and she was crying. There were tears running down her cheek, but she wasn't making any noise, and she wasn't talking. And that was the last time I saw her in person.